would like to welcome you to the Mesabi Community Band's Spring Concert. Would you please rise for the national anthem? Can everybody hear me? I think I get a lot of exercise going back and forth. So, the next march we're going to do is a Henry Fillmore March called the Crosley March. piece we're going to do for you is called English Folk Song Suite by Ron Williams. I remember doing this for many years in different bands, military bands, high school, college. Now this is a contest piece, I believe. This is class 1. Right, Bill?
Yep.
Well, he would know. give him a little bit of a rest here. The next piece we're going to do is Peer Gynt Suite by Grieg. It's a story about a Norwegian boy that isn't very, well, let's see, not very nice. And he goes on a journey. And during this journey, he has a bunch of different adventures. One of the adventures is that he ends up in a mountain with trolls. This is where the Hall of the Mountain King comes from. So he ends up, the king of the mountain trolls wants Peer to marry his daughter. Well, he didn't want that. So he tried to sneak away at night, and he started off a little bit slowly, sneaking away like he would, and then the king caught on. So he gathered his other trolls and started to chase him. And as he went, he got faster and faster and faster. Finally, Peer escaped out of the Hall of the Mountain and fell down, hit his head on a rock. This is the way I heard the story anyway. And then he wakes up in the morning to a song. And we're going to play that one first. It's kind of in backwards order, but that's what it is. Morning. Oh. last but not least, in the Hall of the Mountain King, feel here running from the trolls.
Well, you are in for a real treat. We have something you probably haven't heard of many times. We have a tuba duet duet. And I have to say that we have 4 tuba players in this band that any band director in the world would love. They are very enthusiastic.
They're very good players, and they have a lot of fun at the same time. So they create, now in the summer band, they create a lot of fun for us. Skip Ferris and Ray Peterson. Okay. Ray Susan, yeah. Like a dummy. Anyhow, Ray is, I won't tell Skip's age, but Ray is a 15-year-old tuba player that started a couple of years ago. And I'm giving this little speech part of it for all of you so that if you can encourage somebody, Ray takes piano lessons from a fantastic piano teacher in Cook, and he played quite a nice piano. And so that was the big part of it. And I've had the pleasure of giving them lessons for a couple of years. They're going to play something called duet, which sounds kind of simple, but it's out of a book. And the guy that, if you're an old guy that played or an old gal that played a little brass instrument or years ago, or maybe even trumpets. We all learned on Arpin's books. They were about that thick. Took you about hour a day of practice just to get through a few lessons and many hours. Many probably worked out in Arpin's book. The other book that was very popular at the time was the Songs. Okay, and so that's what they're playing, duet, Songs. Have it.
That was a lot of notes. I think that Bill agreed to pay them per note. So, Bill, get your pocketbook out. They're expecting it. Thanks again, once again, for being here at this concert tonight. It means a lot to us as performers. We can play this music all we want for ourselves, but it doesn't make any difference if we can't play for an audience. So, thanks for being here tonight. My name is Daniel Melby. I'm one of the other baton wavers that stands in front of this wonderful group of very talented musicians. And we're going to be doing 4 pieces for me tonight, the first of which is entitled Into the Clouds by Richard Saucedo. And it is a whirlwind of fun. Our goal with that was to go as fast as possible. You know, if you've ever gone on an airplane flight before, as soon as you take off and you get above the clouds, everything is just moving so fast that you can't really pay attention to one individual thing. And the minute you focus on one thing, everything else kind of goes away for a little bit. Into the Clouds is meant to be, by Richard Sassado's writing, so fast that you can't focus on any one thing, but you can just focus on everything. Just like it's when you're above the clouds in an airplane going over 30,000 feet with your Wi-Fi. So, beautiful piece of music written by Richard Sassado, and incredible band playing this music too. Next piece of music on this portion of the program is entitled Amazing Grace, which you all know. What you might not know, this arrangement by Frank Ticheli, one of the standard pieces of slow music in the wind band repertoire. It is absolutely gorgeous. And Sue Stevens is an incredible saxophonist, and I'll let her play her melody for you all now as we play Amazing Grace. I look like I'm working really hard up on the podium there, but like, no, they're working way harder than me. They do all of the work. It's incredible what a group of people can do when given a common goal, a common objective, a common wish, a common dream, anything. It's amazing what musicians can do. So. This next one's a little bit different. We gotta lighten up the mood a little bit here. If you've ever seen West Side Story, you might have heard of this tune, America, from West Side Story. Thank you very much. I hope you were dancing as much as we were dancing. That's a lot of fun. Last tune in this portion of the program. Before I introduce this piece of music, I just want to say thank you to this incredible audience out here for coming. We really appreciate the opportunity to play in front of a full audience like this. Music support in this area is incredible. I know that if you've read the news, if you've seen all the things, music is, I want to use the words under attack, but there's things that are happening that are affecting our music programs in the area. And I don't think that, I wish that we didn't have to go through these challenges. But what I'd like to command in charge of you is that you would, if you like music in these communities, if you would continue to speak up that music needs to have a place in our schools, that music needs to have educators that are qualified and skilled and ready to educate our students, because this doesn't happen unless we have music education in our schools. And so, I know at the end of the day, we're at a crunch for money right now. And it's obvious and you can see it. It's written out there as clear as day. But we need musicians. This is something that changes lives in here. And I know a lot of other things change lives too, but we cannot give up on this awesome dream that all these kids are having in their schools to grow to be musicians. It's something that stays with you forever. Some say it's a lifelong sport, and we need to continue to advocate and speak up when things aren't right. And we need to speak up and make sure that people hear that we need music in our communities, because it is It's like the bedrock of what makes these Iron Range schools as great as they are. And it's been that way for so long, and it needs to continue that way for a long time to come so that we have concerts to attend that sound as wonderful as this and as wonderful as all the musicians in our local schools do. So please continue to speak up. Please continue to advocate for music and tell them that you need to have music in your schools as a community member. So thank you for what you're able to do to help advocate for that on our behalf. The last piece of music on our portion of the program before we move on to a very impressive portion of our program is a tune called Amparito Roca. Sorry. It's a wonderful Spanish paso doble. It is often in our American culture played way too fast. I told these musicians the first time I got up in the front of on the podium this concert series, and I said, Spanish people take naps. Spanish people get up late and stay up late, and they do whatever they do in the bars and stay up late, and then they get up late again, and everything is so slow-paced over there, and we are the exact opposite over here. We get up early and we do things forever, and that's the way we go, and so we want to play this music fast, but no, this music is meant to be played relaxingly slow. And there's so much nuance in this piece of music that you'll hear, and I hope that the different sections will highlight that as they play those parts. This is Amparito Roca, this Spanish march.
You are in for a real treat. Don here is going to play my absolute most favorite flute solo in the world, called the Chaminade Flute Concertino. We learned a little while we were studying this, and people were, you get phones and Googles and you can look up things. So I always thought of it as just a great, beautiful piece of music. But, Chaminade, of course, is French, and so you can imagine the stories that would go along with it. First of all, just the fact that she was she and a composer in the 1900s, early 1900s, late 1800s, is amazing, because women weren't allowed to, they used to use initials instead of putting seal, they would put C and stuff like that because they didn't want to be known as they didn't think that people would play the music if it was written by a woman. Well, anyhow, she wrote this for one of her former lovers, and she said, I'll fix him, because she was getting married to somebody else, and she starts off with this beautiful, beautiful melody, and then it gets pretty wild in the middle, and the guy probably couldn't play it, so he was probably mad at her. So Dawn comes from a musical family. Her dad is still a musician in the Madison area, a jazz musician. She has two sons that I know of that are excellent musicians themselves and Dawn did this back when she was a youngster a couple of years ago. And so enjoy. just amazing. Hope. We've talked about this for probably a couple of years, and when she told me she had played it before, I said, "Guess what? We're gonna order it. We're gonna get it. We're gonna play it." And it's a compliment to the band to play an accompaniment that is not an easy job, because she plays with some freedom, etc., and so they have to really watch to be on the proper place in the accompaniment and to play soft enough, So it's actually originally written for orchestra and flute and piano, and then flute and orchestra, and then in about 1960, a guy wrote it for band. Thank heavens. So I've heard it many times with the piano accompaniment, but with band accompaniment, not that many times. So again, along with the others that have thanked you, we thank you for being here. It means a lot to us. Our band is called the Mesabi Community Band. When we say community, that's why Ray and Skip are playing, 15 years old and 100 years old, whatever he is. and it's for anybody that wants to play. Many of our musicians hadn't played for years and then joined up, and we put them down in section little ways and help them and get them back in. And after a short while, you'd be surprised, you'd be right back in prime shape. So, and I do apologize for our announcing system here. We have a beautiful system installed, and we just couldn't get it to work. So if you wonder why I forget things, it's because this was going on all day long. My phone never stopped ringing today, and we were here this morning setting up and that. So I can smell coffee back there. So you're in for a real treat with a little Italian music. You always have to put. I was taught well by my predecessor, Bob Waldrica, that you got to have at least one Italian tune on there. So these are Frank Sinatra songs, and they are absolutely all beautiful. And one of my favorites is the last one, My Way, which I've gotten in trouble for playing a couple of times. But anyway, it starts off with Theme from New York, New York. It was a very good year. It's the second tune. The Lady is a Tramp, and then finally, My Way. And again, I thank you for being here tonight. When Mr. Melby gave his speech there, boy, what he had to say is exactly what's going on. That's, my life is just tearing apart when I see cuts. And so I pulled out of my drawer when after these guys are pretty young, that are getting cut in that. So for all my years of teaching towards retirement, and as people graduate from college and that, they would send me cards. And it wasn't always thanks for being a good teacher or anything like that. It was music meant so much to me. I think that's why this gal was wrote me a letter, just graduated. This was years ago that I wrote, and she had just graduated from St. Scholastica with honors. She said, because I had music. Just remember that. Frank Sinatra. know you've been here a long time, but you want one more mark, we got one more. Okay? And then, only if you promise that you'll stay at Easter.